I'm 71 years old now, and every evening at 6 o'clock, I still set 2 plates at my kitchen table. One for me, and one for a friend who hasn't shown up in 8 years. His name was Thorn, at least that's what I called him, and he was a Bigfoot. For 33 years, we shared dinner together almost every single night. He'd wait at the edge of my property line in the Montana wilderness, and I'd bring out food, and we'd sit together in comfortable silence while the sun went down. It became the most important part of my day, the most important relationship of my life. And then one October evening in 2016, he simply didn't come, and he never came back. This is the story of how a lonely man found family in the most unexpected place, how a simple act of kindness turned into 3 decades of friendship, and what it means to lose someone the world doesn't even believe exists. September 1983. I was 33 years old, recently divorced, living alone in a small house on 40 acres of heavily forested land outside of Hungry Horse, Montana. I worked as a long-haul truck driver, which meant I was gone for days at a time. And when I came home, I was grateful for the silence and solitude. The divorce had been ugly, the kind where you lose not just a spouse, but most of your friends too, since they all had to pick sides. So I'd chosen isolation over awkwardness, wilderness over people. That's why when I came home from a week-long haul to Seattle and found large, strange tracks in the mud near my property line, my first thought wasn't curiosity or fear. It was irritation that someone or something was trespassing. It was late afternoon when I pulled my truck into the driveway, exhausted from 3 days of driving through rain. All I wanted was a hot shower and to sleep in my own bed. But as I walked around the side of the house to check on the generator, I saw them. The tracks were in the soft mud near the creek, clear as day. Each print was enormous, maybe 18 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot, with 5 distinct toe impressions pressed deep into the earth. The stride length between prints was at least 5 feet. Whatever had made them was big, heavy, and walking upright. I crouched down next to the clearest print, my knees protesting after hours in the truck. The toes were splayed, the way a human's foot looks when walking barefoot, not bunched together like a bear's paw. And there was an arch, subtle but definitely there. I'd grown up in Montana, had hunted since I was 12, knew every animal track in these mountains. This wasn't a bear. Bears lumber on all fours, and even when they rear up, their back feet don't make prints like this. This was something else entirely. My first instinct was to grab my rifle from the house, but as I stood there in the fading light, looking at those impossible tracks leading from the forest to the creek and back again, I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something closer to recognition. Whatever had made these prints had come to the creek for water. It had been careful, staying close to the tree line, approaching and retreating along the same path. It hadn't come near the house. It hadn't damaged anything or left signs of aggression. It had just been thirsty. I thought about the past year, about how I'd been living. I came home, kept to myself, spoke to people only when necessary, built walls between me and everyone who might hurt me again. I'd turned into someone who saw connection as a liability, who preferred animals to people because animals didn't lie or leave. And standing there looking at those tracks, I realized that whatever had made them was doing the same thing I was, staying hidden, avoiding contact, just trying to exist without being hurt. I didn't grab the rifle that day. Instead, I went inside, unpacked my truck, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined how human those tracks looked. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about something out there in the forest, something that walked on 2 legs and was trying very hard not to be seen, something that was, in its own way, just as alone as I was. The tracks appeared every few days over the next 2 weeks, always in the same area near the creek that marked the boundary between my property and national forest land. I'd see them when I was outside doing maintenance, splitting wood, checking my generator. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own boot prints, with 5 distinct toes and a stride length that suggested something very tall. I knew about bears. I'd lived in Montana my whole life, but these weren't bear tracks. The pattern was wrong. The depth was wrong. The way they moved was wrong. Something bipedal and heavy was visiting my property regularly, staying just inside the tree line, watching. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, instead of calling the authorities or grabbing my rifle, I decided to leave food. It was a Thursday evening in early October, and I'd just finished a venison roast that had turned out better than expected. I had plenty of leftovers, more than I could eat before my next haul, and I was standing at my kitchen window looking out at the tree line when the idea came to me. It was absurd, completely irrational. But I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was out there was hungry, that it kept coming back to the creek not just for water, but because it was looking for something else, safety maybe, or connection. I wrapped the leftover venison in aluminum foil, added some bread and an apple, and walked out to the edge of my property with the bundle in my hands. My heart was pounding like I was doing something dangerous, which I suppose I was. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I'd been thinking about those tracks for 2 weeks, about the careful way they approached and retreated, never coming closer than necessary. If something wanted to hurt me, it had plenty of opportunities when I was outside working. Instead, it kept its distance. It was being respectful. I found a flat rock about 20 yards from the tree line, a spot where the tracks usually appeared, and I set the food down. Then I stepped back, suddenly feeling incredibly foolish. What was I doing? Leaving a care package for Bigfoot. If my ex-wife could see me now, she'd have more ammunition for her claim that I'd lost my mind after the divorce. If any of my buddies from the trucking company knew about this, I'd never hear the end of it. But as I stood there in the cooling evening air, watching the shadows lengthen between the trees, I realized I wasn't doing this for any logical reason. I was doing it because I knew what it felt like to be alone and cautious, to hover at the edges of other people's lives without quite joining in. I was doing it because reaching out, even to something unknown and possibly dangerous, felt better than the isolation I'd been living in. I was doing it because maybe, just maybe, we both needed someone to notice we existed. I went back inside and watched from the window until it got too dark to see. The food stayed on the rock, untouched. I didn't know if it would ever be taken. I didn't know if I was feeding a creature or just my own loneliness. But I'd made the gesture, and somehow that mattered more than whether it was returned. It took 11 days before the food was touched. I'd been leaving venison scraps, bread, whatever leftovers I had from my own meals, setting them on a flat rock about 20 yards from the tree line where the tracks always appeared. Every morning I'd check, and every morning the food would still be there, untouched, sometimes covered in frost. I started to feel foolish, like I was feeding some fantasy instead of an actual creature. But on the 12th morning, the rock was empty. The food was gone, and in the dirt beside the rock was a perfect handprint, massive and deliberate, pressed into the ground like a signature, like a thank you. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with an animal. I was dealing with something intelligent, something that understood what I was offering and had decided to accept it. I knelt down next to that handprint and just stared at it. The morning sun was barely up, frost still clinging to the grass, and my breath came out in clouds. The print was enormous, maybe 10 inches across the palm, with 5 thick fingers that had pressed into the damp earth with enough force to leave clear ridge patterns. Not fur texture, not rough hide, but something that looked disturbingly close to human skin. I reached out and placed my own hand next to it for comparison. Mine looked like a child's hand beside it. My hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. This was real. Whatever I'd been telling myself about bear activity or my imagination, this handprint made it undeniable. Something intelligent had taken the food I'd left and had made the deliberate choice to leave a mark, to communicate. And that realization terrified me more than anything else could have, because animals are predictable. Animals follow instinct, but intelligence means choice, means unpredictability, means I had no idea what I was dealing with or what it might do next. I should have stopped right then, should have called someone, the Forest Service, the sheriff, hell, maybe even a newspaper. This was evidence of something that wasn't supposed to exist. But even as I thought about it, I knew I wouldn't make that call. Because I kept thinking about those 11 days of untouched food, 11 days of whatever this was watching from the trees, weighing whether it was safe to trust me. It had made itself vulnerable by accepting the food, by revealing that it was intelligent enough to understand gestures of goodwill. And if I reported this, if I brought authorities and cameras and chaos to my property, that trust would be shattered. Whatever this creature was, it would disappear back into the forest and never return. I took a photograph of the handprint with my old Polaroid camera, more for myself than anything else, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Then I went inside and made breakfast, but I couldn't eat. I just sat at my kitchen table, looking out at the tree line, wondering what I'd started. Because leaving food was one thing, but communication, that changed everything. That meant responsibility. That meant I was choosing to keep this secret, to protect something I didn't understand, to build a relationship with a creature that the world insisted couldn't be real. And despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I knew I'd keep leaving food. Because loneliness recognizes loneliness, even across impossible distances. And for the first time in a year, I didn't feel quite so alone. 3 weeks after the handprint, I saw him for the first time. It was early October, and I was outside grilling a steak for dinner around 5:30 in the evening, which was later than I usually ate. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the pines, and I had that feeling you get when you're being watched. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing just inside the tree line about 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir. He was at least 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung past his knees. His face was more human than ape, with a flat nose, a heavy brow, and eyes that caught the evening light. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, I did something that surprised both of us. I took my plate, walked to the edge of my porch, and set it down on the top step. Then I went back inside, grabbed another plate, loaded it with food, and placed it on the ground at the base of the steps. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get inside. Lock the door, grab my rifle. He was massive, easily twice my weight, with hands that could probably crush my skull without effort. But he wasn't moving toward me. He was just standing there, half hidden, watching with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not aggressive, not threatening. If anything, he looked as uncertain as I felt. I stepped back up onto the porch and sat down on the top step, next to my plate. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip my knees to steady them. Quote Norris, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. Quote Nanalatsuri Kwan. He didn't move for a long time. Long enough that I started to wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake, if I'd pushed too far, too fast. Then, slowly, with movements that were surprisingly graceful for something so large, he stepped out from behind the tree. He moved carefully, deliberately, like someone walking through a room full of sleeping people they didn't want to wake. Each step was placed with precision, and his eyes never left mine. When he reached the plate at the base of the steps, he paused. We were maybe 15 feet apart now, close enough that I could see the individual hairs on his arms, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, the surprising expressiveness of his face. He looked down at the food, then back at me. And I saw something in his eyes that made my throat tighten. Gratitude. And something else. Relief, maybe. Or recognition that he wasn't alone anymore either. He picked up the plate with both hands, his fingers surprisingly deft, and he sat down right there on the ground, not running back to the tree line with the food, not grabbing it and fleeing. He sat down, maybe 10 feet from my porch steps, and he started to eat, and I started to eat. And we ate dinner together in silence while the sun went down over the Cabinet Mountains and the evening birds called from the forest. I'd shared thousands of meals with people over the years, family dinners, dates with my ex-wife, lunches with trucking buddies at roadside diners, but I'd never shared a meal that felt like this. There was something profound about it, something that went beyond the simple act of eating. It was trust. It was acknowledgement. It was two completely different beings choosing companionship over isolation. When he finished, he set the plate down carefully, stood, and looked at me one more time. Then he turned and walked back into the forest, his movements unhurried, confident. And I sat there on my porch steps in the gathering darkness, realizing that my life had just changed in a way I'd never be able to explain to another human being. By November, we had a schedule. Every evening at 6 o'clock, I'd cook dinner for two. I'd set one plate on my porch table and carry the other to a spot we'd both silently agreed on, a flat area near the fire pit about 15 yards from the house. He'd emerge from the forest right at 6, sometimes a minute or two late if the weather was bad, but always punctual enough that I could set my watch by him. At first, he'd wait until I went back inside before approaching the food. Then, he started eating while I was still on the porch, keeping that 15-yard distance between us. By the time the first snow fell, we were eating at the same time, him standing near the fire pit, me sitting on my porch steps, both of us watching the sun set over the Cabinet Mountains. We didn't talk. I didn't even know if he could understand English. But the silence felt companionable rather than awkward. For a man who'd spent the last year avoiding human connection, it was the first time since the divorce that I didn't feel completely alone. I started thinking about what to cook during the day while I was driving my routes. Should I make pot roast tonight, or maybe that chicken and potato dish? Would he like salmon? I'd never cooked for anyone with this kind of attention before. My ex-wife used to complain that I treated meals like fuel stops, just something to get through. But cooking for him, for this creature I'd started calling Thorn in my head because of the ridge of hair along his spine, it felt different. It felt like I was taking care of someone, and someone was letting me. One evening in late November, I brought out a thermos of hot coffee along with dinner. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees, and I could see my breath in the porch light. I poured myself a cup and set the thermos down on the step, half as an offering, half just to have it nearby. Thorn watched me drink, his head tilted slightly, curious. On impulse, I poured a second cup and walked halfway to the fire pit, closer than I'd ever ventured during dinner time, and set it on the ground. Then I backed up to my spot on the steps. He approached the cup slowly, picked it up with both hands and sniffed it. Then he took a sip, and I swear I saw surprise flash across his face. He looked at me, then at the cup, then back at me, and made a low sound, almost like a rumble of approval. And he drank the whole thing. After that, coffee became part of our routine. Those evenings became the center of my world. I turned down halls that would keep me away overnight. I scheduled my routes to be back by 5:30. My dispatcher kept asking what was going on, if I had a girlfriend, and I'd just laugh and say something vague. Because how do you explain that the best part of your day is eating dinner in silence with a creature that shouldn't exist? How do you tell people that you feel more connected to something that can't speak than you ever felt to your wife of 8 years? The truth was, Thorn didn't expect anything from me except consistency. He didn't judge me, didn't criticize, didn't compare me to some version of myself I could never live up to. He just showed up every evening at 6 o'clock, ate the food I'd prepared, and kept me company while the stars came out. And somehow, that simple exchange, that uncomplicated presence, started to heal something in me I didn't even know was broken. I was building a life around a secret. And I'd never been happier. The winter of 1983 into 84 was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 20 below, snow piled 4 feet deep, and my truck couldn't make it down the unplowed access road for nearly 3 weeks in January. I was running low on firewood, rationing what I had left, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake buying property this remote. I kept feeding Thorn, that's what I'd started calling him in my head because of the way his hair formed a ridge along his spine like thorns, even though it meant I was eating less myself. Then one morning I woke up to find a pile of dead, dry wood stacked neatly against the side of my house. It was good wood, already seasoned, broken to the perfect length for my wood stove. I knew immediately who'd left it. That evening when he came for dinner, I tried to thank him. I pressed my hand to my chest and bowed slightly, the way you might thank someone when you don't speak the same language. He looked at me for a long moment, then did something extraordinary. He reached out, very slowly and carefully, and touched his massive hand to my shoulder. Just once. Gentle as anything. Then he took his plate and ate dinner. That's when I realized we'd crossed over from feeding arrangement to friendship. I'd been waking up every morning that week to a house that was getting colder despite the wood stove running constantly. I was down to maybe 3 days of firewood, and the forecast showed no break in the weather. The snow was so deep that even if I could somehow get my truck down the access road, which I couldn't, the main highway was closed. I was well and truly stuck. And I'd spent 2 nights lying awake doing math in my head, trying to figure out if I could heat just the bedroom and kitchen, if I could stretch my remaining wood another week, maybe 2 if I was willing to freeze. But I never considered not feeding Thorn. Even when it meant cooking smaller portions for myself, even when it meant using precious fuel and heat to prepare his dinner. He showed up every evening at 6 o'clock, trudging through snow that came up to my waist but barely reached his knees, and I wasn't going to let him down. He depended on me now. That responsibility meant something. The morning I found the firewood, I actually cried. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth. I stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, my breath fogging in the bitter cold, looking at that neat stack of wood that represented warmth, safety, survival, and I felt something break open in my chest, because Thorn had noticed. He'd seen me struggling, had understood what I needed, and had helped me. He'd carried wood through a blizzard in the middle of the night to make sure I'd be okay. That evening, when his hand touched my shoulder, I felt the weight of it, the warmth despite the cold, the careful gentleness. His hand was easily twice the size of mine, with strength that could have broken me without effort. But the touch was soft, deliberate, tender even. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. But in that moment, I understood something fundamental about the creature standing in front of me. He had empathy. He had the capacity to care about someone other than himself. He understood reciprocity and kindness and gratitude. I'd been divorced for over a year at that point, and in all that time, my ex-wife hadn't once checked to see if I was okay, if I was surviving, if I needed anything. But this creature, this impossible being that the world insisted couldn't exist, had noticed I was struggling and had done something about it. He'd taken care of me the way I'd been taking care of him. That night, after he left, I brought in the firewood he'd gathered and fed my stove until the house was warm again, and I understood with complete clarity that I wasn't alone anymore. I had a friend. And I'd protect that friendship with everything I had. By the spring of 1984, my entire life had reorganized itself around those evening dinners. I started planning my truck routes differently, turning down longer hauls that would keep me away for more than 4 or 5 days. I'd push hard to make deliveries, sometimes driving 12 hours straight just so I could get home by 6 o'clock. My dispatcher noticed the change. He asked one day in June. I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. I'd started buying better food, cooking actual meals instead of heating up canned soup or frozen dinners. I taught myself to make stews, roasts, even baked bread a few times. If I was going to share dinner with someone every night, even if that someone wasn't human, I wanted it to be good. The divorce had left me hollow and angry, but this routine, this unlikely friendship, was filling something in me I hadn't realized was empty. I stopped dreading coming home to an empty house because the house wasn't empty anymore. Thorn was there, waiting. The lying bothered me more than I expected. I'd always thought of myself as an honest person, straightforward, the kind of guy who said what he meant. But now I was spinning stories for everyone. When my dispatcher offered me a 2-week run to California that would have paid double my usual rate, I told him I had family obligations. When my buddy Rick invited me to go fishing for a weekend, I said I was dealing with property maintenance issues. When my mother called and asked why I never came to visit anymore, I made excuses about work and money and being tired. Every lie felt necessary and wrong at the same time. Because what was the alternative? Tell them the truth? Quote, before. They'd think I'd lost my mind. They'd probably have me committed. Or worse, they'd believe me and show up with cameras and guns and destroy the one good thing I had in my life. One evening in July, I was driving back from a delivery in Spokane, pushing to make it home by 6. I'd been on the road for 11 hours, my back was killing me, and I was exhausted. A reasonable person would have pulled over at a motel in Missoula, gotten a hot meal and a good night's sleep. But it was 5:15, and if I pushed hard, I could make it. So I bought a large coffee at a truck stop, rolled down the windows to keep myself alert, and drove the last 90 miles doing 70 on mountain roads that should have been taken at 50. I pulled into my driveway at 5:58, barely had time to throw together leftovers from my refrigerator, heat them up, and get outside. Thorne emerged from the tree line at exactly 6 o'clock, same as always, and when he saw me standing there with plates ready, he made a sound that I'd learned meant contentment, almost like a sigh of relief. And standing there, exhausted and sore and probably slightly dangerous from caffeine and lack of sleep, I realized I'd just risked my life to make it to dinner on time. I'd driven recklessly, pushed myself past safe limits, all because I couldn't bear the thought of Thorne showing up to an empty yard, because I knew what that would feel like for him, the confusion, the worry, the fear that something had changed, that he wasn't wanted anymore. I couldn't do that to him. I wouldn't. That's when I understood how completely my priorities had shifted. A year ago, before Thorne, I would have taken that California run without hesitation. I would have gone fishing with Rick. I would have put money and career and normal human relationships first. But now I was turning down opportunities, lying to people I cared about, and restructuring my entire life around 6 o'clock dinners with a creature the world insisted didn't exist. And the strangest part was that I didn't regret it. Not for a second. Because for the first time since my divorce, I felt like I mattered to someone. Like my presence was important. Like showing up meant something. Thorne didn't care that I wasn't successful enough or ambitious enough, or whatever else my ex-wife had decided was wrong with me. He just cared that I was there at 6 o'clock with dinner and companionship. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. Sometime during the second year, we started communicating in ways that went beyond just sharing food. I'd point at things, clouds, birds, the mountains, and he'd look where I pointed, sometimes making soft vocalizations that sounded like agreement or acknowledgement. He showed me things too, a nest of owls in a dead tree, a place where the creek widened into a pool full of trout, animal tracks I didn't recognize. He'd gesture, leading me a little ways into the forest, always checking to make sure I was following, always staying close. I started to understand his expressions, the slight tilt of his head when he was curious, the way his shoulders relaxed when he was content, the tension in his posture when something in the forest was wrong. And I think he learned to read me too. On bad days when I'd had trouble with a delivery or was feeling the weight of loneliness, he'd stay longer. Sometimes he'd sit on the ground near the fire pit, closer than usual, just being present. We never touched except for that one time, but we didn't need to. The companionship was enough. There was one evening in particular, August of 1985, that showed me just how deep our connection had become. I'd had the worst day I'd had in months. My truck had broken down outside of Missoula. The repair ate up most of my savings, and while I was dealing with that, my ex-wife's lawyer had called about some paperwork I'd apparently signed wrong. By the time I made it home, it was almost 7 o'clock, an hour late, and I was so wrapped up in my own frustration that I'd barely thought about what that would mean for Thorne. But he was there, waiting near the tree line. He'd stayed, and when I came out with the plates, apologizing even though I knew he couldn't understand the words, he didn't eat right away like he usually did. He just looked at me, his head tilted in that way that meant he was trying to figure something out. Then he made a low sound, almost questioning, and gestured toward me with one large hand. Quote, 5. I said, which was a lie, and apparently he knew it. He set his plate down, moved closer than he usually did during dinner, maybe only 8 feet away, and sat down on the ground. Then he waited. Just sat there, watching me with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through every wall I'd built. And something about that patient presence, that wordless understanding broke through my defenses. I started talking. Told him about the truck, about the money, about feeling like I couldn't do anything right, about being 35 years old and living alone in the woods because I couldn't figure out how to be around people anymore. He couldn't understand the words, I knew that, but he listened anyway. He stayed still, attentive, and every so often he'd make a soft sound that felt like acknowledgement. When I finally ran out of words, we just sat there in the gathering darkness. And then Thorn did something he'd never done before. He reached out slowly and placed a small stone on the ground between us. It was smooth and round, river-worn, the kind you'd skip across water. It wasn't much, just a rock, but the gesture was clear. He was offering me something, a gift, a comfort, a way of saying, you can quote 6. I picked up that stone, and I still have it today, sitting on my kitchen windowsill. It's just a rock. But it represents the moment I realized that friendship doesn't require a shared language. It doesn't require words or explanations, or even full understanding. Sometimes it just requires presence. Someone willing to sit with you in the dark and listen to the sound of your pain, even if they can't fix it. Thorn taught me that. A creature that wasn't supposed to exist taught me more about compassion and connection than most humans I'd known. And I understood, sitting there with that stone in my hand, that I'd do anything to protect him. That this strange, impossible friendship had become the most important thing in my life. October 1987. I'd been sharing dinner with Thorn for 4 years, and I'd gotten complacent about secrecy. It never occurred to me that someone might be watching from the forest, that our routine might be visible to others. But on a cold Tuesday evening, right in the middle of dinner, I heard a shout. "Holy Christ, don't move!" A hunter emerged from the trees on the north side of my property, rifle raised, aiming directly at Thorn. He was about 50 yards away, wearing blaze orange, breathing hard like he'd been running. He shouted at me. Thorn froze, his plate still in his hands, his eyes locked on the rifle. I could see the fear in his posture, the way he'd tensed, ready to run. And in that split second, I made a choice that I knew would define everything that came after. I stepped between Thorn and the hunter, putting my body directly in the line of fire. "Lower your weapon," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "He's not dangerous. He's a friend." The hunter stared at me like I'd just announced I could fly. Quote, 112. His rifle was still raised, finger on the trigger, and I could see he was serious. He was going to shoot, I said, keeping my voice calm even though my heart was trying to punch through my ribcage. Behind me, I could hear Thorn's breathing, fast and shallow. I didn't dare turn around to look at him, didn't want to take my eyes off the hunter, but I could feel his fear like a physical presence. He was trusting me to handle this, to protect him, and the weight of that trust was crushing. "You're feeding it?" the hunter asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "You've been feeding it? Jesus Christ, man, don't you know what these things do? They kill people. There are reports, disappearances, attacks." "Not him," I interrupted. "Not Thorn. He's gentle. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm telling you the truth. Just lower the rifle and we can talk about this." The hunter's hands were shaking slightly, whether from adrenaline or uncertainty, I couldn't tell. For a long moment, we all just stood there, frozen in this terrible tableau. Me standing between a rifle and my friend, the hunter trying to decide if I was brave or insane, and Thorn behind me, probably calculating whether he could make it to the tree line before the shot came. If you shoot," I said quietly, "you'll have to shoot me first. And I'm not moving." I don't know what the hunter saw in my face, but something shifted in his expression. Maybe he saw determination. Maybe he saw desperation. Maybe he just realized I was serious and he didn't want to kill a man over this. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered the rifle. "You're making a mistake," he said. "That thing is going to turn on you someday." "Maybe," I said, "but that's my risk to take." The hunter backed away, keeping his eyes on both of us, and eventually disappeared into the forest. I stood there for a long time after he left, my legs shaking so badly I thought they might give out. When I finally turned around, Thorn was gone. His plate was on the ground, the food untouched, and the forest was silent. That night, I understood the real cost of our friendship. It wasn't just my time or my money or my lies to other people. It was the fact that I'd just been willing to die for him, and I'd do it again without hesitation. That's how completely he'd become part of my life. The hunter's name was Dale Pritchard, and he was from Kalispell, hunting elk on public land that bordered my property. He'd seen Thorn coming out of the forest and had tracked him to my place, thinking he'd discovered the find of the century. For 20 minutes, I stood on my property and lied more convincingly than I ever had in my life. I told him Thorn was a man in a suit, a friend of mine who was a wildlife enthusiast, testing out a costume for a documentary about Bigfoot hoaxes. I showed him my truck, my normal life, made jokes about how dedicated my friend was to the project. Dale was skeptical at first, but Thorn, bless him, understood what was happening. He'd moved back into the tree line during my explanation, and when Dale insisted on getting closer, Thorn did something brilliant. He waved an awkward, very human gesture, like someone embarrassed to be caught in a costume. Dale left confused and probably not entirely convinced, but without proof, and with my sincere insistence that it was all harmless fun, there wasn't much he could do. After his truck disappeared down the access road, I sat on my porch steps and shook for an hour. Thorn didn't come back that night, and I didn't blame him. The lies came out of me so smoothly it scared me. I laughed, made myself seem slightly embarrassed, played the part of a guy caught doing something eccentric but harmless. "Yeah, I know it looks crazy," I told Dale, forcing a sheepish grin. "My buddy Mike from Missoula, he's making this documentary about Bigfoot hoaxes, you know? Debunking all the fake footage. He's trying to make the most realistic costume possible to show how easy it is to fool people. I let him test it out here because my property's remote and we didn't think anyone would see." Dale looked at me, then back at the tree line where Thorn had retreated. "That's one hell of a costume," he said slowly. "I've never seen anything move like that." "Mike used to do special effects in Hollywood," I said, inventing details as I went. "Worked on some horror movies. He's really into making it realistic. The movement, the way the hair catches the light, all of it. When Thorn waved from the trees, that awkward little gesture that was so obviously forced, so clearly uncomfortable, it was the detail that sold the lie. Because what monster would wave? What wild creature would make such a distinctly human social gesture?" Dale's shoulders relaxed slightly, and I knew I had him. But after he left, after I'd watched his truck disappear and knew we were safe, the reality of what I'd done hit me. I'd become the kind of person who could lie without hesitation, who could manufacture an entire false story on the spot, who could look another person in the eye and deceive them completely. And the worst part was that I'd do it again. I'd lie to anyone, everyone, whatever it took to keep Thorn safe. That night, I set out dinner at 6 o'clock like always. But Thorn didn't come. The food sat there getting cold while I waited on the porch, hoping, but the forest stayed dark and silent. At 7 o'clock, I brought the plates back inside. At 8 o'clock, I finally accepted that he wasn't coming. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about what Thorn must be feeling, the fear, the betrayal of having someone discover his sanctuary. He'd trusted me to keep him safe, and I'd failed. A hunter had gotten close enough to aim a rifle at him, close enough to kill him, and now Thorn was out there in the forest, probably deciding whether it was safe to ever come back. I wondered if 4 years of friendship could survive one moment of exposure. I wondered if I'd just lost the most important relationship of my life because I'd gotten careless. And I knew, sitting there in the darkness of my kitchen, that if Thorn never came back, I'd deserve it. Thorn didn't return for 5 days after the hunter incident. 5 days of me setting out food that went uneaten. 5 days of watching the tree line and seeing nothing. I started to wonder if I'd lost him, if the fear of discovery had been too much, if he'd decided the risk wasn't worth the friendship. Then, on the 6th evening, he appeared, cautious, staying further back than usual. I had prepared for this. I'd spent those 5 days thinking about how to communicate danger to someone who didn't speak my language. I'd drawn pictures, crude stick figures showing humans with rifles, showing creatures like him being hurt, being taken away. When he finally approached to eat, I showed him the drawings, pointing, using gestures I hoped he'd understand. Danger. humans, hiding. He studied the pictures for a long time, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he did something that broke my heart. He gestured toward himself, then made a motion like running, like leaving. He was asking if he should go, if his presence was putting me in danger. I shook my head firmly and pointed to both of us, then to the ground. Stay, together, safe. He nodded slowly, and we went back to our dinner. But things had changed. We'd acknowledged the reality we both lived in. When he first emerged from the tree line that 6th evening, I felt relief so intense it made me dizzy. He was alive. He'd come back. But he kept his distance, stopping a good 30 yards away, further than he'd stayed since that first month. The trust we'd built was damaged, and I could see it in every careful movement he made. I'd brought the drawings with me, sheets of paper covered in my clumsy attempts at pictographs. I set them on the ground between us and gestured for him to look. He approached slowly, crouched down, and studied them with an intensity that showed just how intelligent he really was. His finger, that massive finger with its surprising dexterity, traced over the stick figures. The human with a gun, the creature running, the creature in what I'd tried to draw as a cage. I watched his face as understanding dawned. His eyes widened slightly, his shoulders tensed, and he made a low sound that I'd learned meant distress. He understood. He'd probably always understood the danger, but seeing it laid out like this, seeing proof that I understood it too, made it real in a new way. Then came the gesture that destroyed me. He pointed at himself, then swept his arm toward the forest, the universal sign for, "I'll go." And the look in his eyes. God, the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear for himself. It was fear for me. He was offering to leave, to disappear back into the wilderness because he thought his presence was putting me at risk. Quote 33. I said out loud, knowing he couldn't understand the word, but hoping he'd understand the tone. I shook my head hard, then pointed at him, then at me, then pressed both hands flat against the ground. Stay, we stay, together. He tilted his head, questioning, and I saw tears forming in my own eyes, which probably confused him. I pointed at the drawing of the human and the creature standing side by side, the one I'd drawn at the bottom of the page, the one that showed friendship, partnership, protection. Then I pointed at us. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. And then Thorn did something he'd only done once before. He reached out and touched my shoulder, that gentle pressure that meant understanding, that meant agreement. We were in this together. Whatever dangers came, we'd face them together. That evening, we ate dinner in a new kind of silence. Not the comfortable companionship we'd built over 4 years, but something heavier, more serious. We'd both acknowledged what we'd been pretending didn't exist, that our friendship was dangerous, that it could end badly, that every day we chose each other was a risk. And we'd both decided the risk was worth it. 1990 came and went. 1995 passed in what felt like weeks. By 2000, I was 50 years old, and Thorn and I had been sharing dinner together for 17 years. 17 years of 6 o'clock meetings, of silent companionship, of learning each other's rhythms. I'd stopped truck driving in 93, my knees were giving out, and I'd taken a job as a night janitor at the elementary school in Hungry Horse. It paid less, but it meant I was always home by 5:30, always there for dinner. I'd had a few relationships over the years, women I'd met at the bar or through friends, but none of them lasted more than a few months. How do you explain to someone why you can't go out to dinner at 6 o'clock? How do you tell them you have a standing commitment you can't break? I chose Thorn over every potential relationship, and I never regretted it. He was more consistent, more present, more genuinely caring than any person I had dated. He was family, the only family I had. There was a woman named Sarah in 97 who almost made me reconsider everything. She was a teacher at the school where I worked, kind and patient, with a laugh that made me feel like maybe I could have a normal life. We dated for 3 months, and she never pushed when I said I couldn't do dinner dates. She suggested lunch instead, breakfast, late evening coffees. She was trying to work around whatever weird thing I had going on, and I appreciated that more than she knew. But then she wanted to take things further, wanted to come to my place, see where I lived, maybe stay over sometime. And I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't risk her being there at 6 o'clock, couldn't risk her seeing Thorn, couldn't bring that secret into someone else's life without their consent. So I made excuses, pushed her away, and eventually she stopped calling. I saw her sometimes at the school, and the hurt in her eyes when she looked at me was like a knife in my chest. I thought about explaining it to her, sitting her down and saying, "Look, I know this sounds insane, but there's a Bigfoot who comes to my house every evening at 6 for dinner, and he's the most important relationship in my life. But how do you say that without sounding completely unhinged?" So I let her go and I went home to Thorn, and I told myself I'd made the right choice, even though it felt like losing something precious. The thing was, Thorn noticed when I was sad. After Sarah stopped coming around, I was quieter during our dinners, lost in my own thoughts. And one evening, Thorn brought me a gift. It was a bird's nest, perfectly intact, delicate and beautiful, something he must have found in the forest and carried carefully to me. He set it down near my feet, then made a soft sound, almost questioning. "Are you okay?" in whatever language we'd created together. I picked up that nest, felt the careful construction of it, the way each twig was woven together to create something safe and secure. And I understood what he was trying to tell me. You have a home, you have family, you're not alone. That's when I stopped thinking of our relationship as some strange arrangement and started understanding it for what it really was. Thorn wasn't a substitute for human connection, he was connection, period. He showed up every single day. He noticed when I was struggling. He brought me gifts. He sat with me through difficult times. He'd been there for 17 years without asking for anything, except my presence and whatever food I could share. That's more than most blood relatives can claim. My mother had passed away in '94. My father was long gone. I had a brother in California I hadn't spoken to in a decade. But I had Thorn. And when I really thought about what family meant, stripped away all the biology and tradition and expectation, it came down to this: someone who shows up, someone who stays, someone who cares whether you're okay. Thorn was my family, the only family that mattered. And I'd spend the rest of my life protecting that, no matter what it cost me. Summer of 2008. Thorn had been coming to dinner for 25 years, and I'd been so focused on the routine, on the comfort of our friendship, that I'd failed to notice something important. He was aging. It hit me one evening in July when he approached the fire pit, moving more slowly than usual, favoring his right leg slightly. His hair, which had always been that deep reddish brown, now had streaks of gray through it, especially around his face and shoulders. He sat down to eat, something he'd started doing more often in recent years, and I saw him wince as he lowered himself to the ground. He was old, not ancient, but old enough that his body was starting to fail him, and I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that I had no idea how long his kind lived. Was he elderly? Middle-aged? Did I have years left with him, or months? I was 68 myself, feeling my own age in my joints and my back, and the thought that I might outlive him, or he might outlive me, had never seriously occurred to me until that moment. That night, I didn't go inside after dinner. I sat on the porch steps and Thorn sat near the fire pit, and we watched the stars come out together in silence, both of us perhaps thinking about time and mortality and what it meant that we'd grown old together. The gray in his hair wasn't subtle once I started looking for it. It had been creeping in gradually over the years, so slowly that I'd convinced myself I was imagining it. But now, in the golden evening light, it was undeniable. The silver streaks around his muzzle, the way his movements had become more careful, more deliberate, even his posture had changed. Where he used to stand straight and powerful, now his shoulders curved slightly forward, the way old men hunch when their backs start giving out. I looked down at my own hands, spotted with age, the knuckles swollen from arthritis. When had I gotten old? When had we both gotten old? It felt like just yesterday I was 33, recently divorced, leaving food on a rock for a creature I'd never seen. But that was 25 years ago, a quarter of a century. We'd spent a quarter of a century eating dinner together, and somehow I'd thought it would just continue forever. unchanging, eternal. Quote 36, I asked him quietly, knowing he couldn't answer, but needing to say it anyway. Does it hurt, your leg? He looked at me with those dark eyes that had watched me age from a bitter young man into an old one. Then he made a sound, low and gentle, that I'd learned meant something like, quote 38, quote, or quote 39, quote. But I could see in his face that it did hurt, that getting up was harder than it used to be, that the 2-mile walk from wherever he lived to my property was taking more out of him. What would I do if he couldn't make the walk anymore? What would I do if one evening he just didn't show up, not because something had happened to him, but because his body couldn't carry him this far? Would I go looking for him? Would I find him somewhere in the forest, too weak to move and have to watch him die alone? The questions I couldn't ask pressed against my chest like a physical weight. How much time did we have left? Would I wake up one morning to find him gone, with no way to know if he'd died or just moved on? Would he have to watch me die first, show up one evening to find the porch empty and no one to share dinner with? We'd built this beautiful, impossible friendship, but we'd never talked about the end of it. We'd never acknowledged that one day, one of us wouldn't be there anymore. And sitting there under the emerging stars, watching Thorn breathe slowly and carefully, I understood that we were in the final chapter of our story. However many years or months or days we had left, they were precious and finite and slipping away. I wanted to tell him what he'd meant to me, wanted to say that these 25 years had been the best of my life, that he'd saved me from a loneliness I might not have survived, that he was the best friend I'd ever had. But all I could do was sit there with him, sharing the silence we'd always shared, hoping he understood. September 2015. I was 75 years old, officially retired from the janitor job, living on Social Security and savings, still cooking dinner for 2 every single evening. Thorn was moving even slower now. The gray in his hair had spread until he was more silver than brown, but he still came faithfully, still sat with me, still made that gentle sound that I'd learned meant contentment. Then one evening in late September, he didn't come alone. I saw movement in the tree line, and Thorn emerged, but behind him, staying back in the shadows, was another figure. Smaller, younger, with darker hair and a more cautious posture. Thorn made a gesture toward the other creature, then toward me, an introduction of sorts. He was showing someone else where he went every evening, sharing our secret with another of his kind. My first reaction was fear. More creatures meant more risk of discovery, more chance of someone seeing something they shouldn't. But as I watched Thorn gesture again, encouraging the younger one to come forward, I understood what was really happening. He was teaching someone else to trust a human. He was passing on what he'd learned, and the weight of that responsibility, the honor of it, made me start cooking for 3. The younger one, I started calling them Shadow, because of how they stayed in the darkness, wouldn't come forward that first evening. Just watched from the tree line while Thorn and I ate our dinner. Thorn kept looking back, making encouraging sounds, gesturing toward the food I'd set out on a 3rd plate. But Shadow stayed hidden, and eventually, when dinner was over, they both disappeared into the forest together. "Who is that?" I asked Thorn the next evening when they appeared together again. "Family? A friend? Someone you're taking care of?" Thorn made a complex series of sounds and gestures that I couldn't fully interpret, but the gentleness in his movements, the protective way he positioned himself between me and Shadow, told me enough. This was someone important to him, someone he wanted to help, someone he wanted me to help. It took 3 weeks before Shadow would eat the food I left. 3 weeks of watching from the shadows while Thorn demonstrated that I was safe, that the food was good, that this strange human could be trusted. And when Shadow finally approached that 3rd plate, moving with quick, nervous steps, I saw something in Thorn's expression that looked almost like pride. Like a father watching his child take their first steps. Shadow was smaller than Thorn, maybe 6.5 feet tall, with darker, almost black hair and features that seemed younger, less weathered. Where Thorn moved with the careful deliberation of age, Shadow had a restless energy, constantly alert, ready to flee at the slightest provocation. But slowly, over the following weeks, that caution began to ease. One evening in October, as we all sat eating together, me on the porch, Thorn near the fire pit, Shadow a little further back, I suddenly understood what Thorn was really doing. He was preparing for something. He was making sure I wouldn't be alone when he was gone. He was passing on our friendship, our routine, our trust to someone who could continue it. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Thorn knew his time was running out. He could feel his body failing, feel the years catching up with him. And he was trying to take care of me the only way he knew how, by making sure someone else would show up at 6 o'clock. So I wouldn't have to face the emptiness alone, I said quietly, my voice thick. But he looked at me with those dark eyes that had watched me for 32 years, and I saw in them a determination that I recognized, because I would have done the same thing for him. If I'd known I was dying, if I'd had the chance to make sure he had someone else, I would have taken it. That's what you do for family. You make sure they're taken care of, even after you're gone. So I started cooking for 3, started learning Shadow's preferences, their gestures, their moods, started building a new relationship while treasuring every moment I had left with the old one. And every evening, when both of them appeared at the tree line, I was grateful for Thorn's gift, even as I dreaded the reason he was giving it. October 17th, 2016. I remember the date because it was a Monday, and I'd just gotten back from the grocery store in Columbia Falls, had bought good steaks because I'd wanted to make something special. The weather was perfect, cool and clear, the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides. I cooked dinner as always, set out 3 plates, Thorn's usual spot, the new one for the younger creature who I'd been calling Shadow, and my own. 6 o'clock came. 6:15. 6:30. Neither of them appeared. I told myself it was fine. Sometimes they were late, sometimes weather or other animals kept them away. But by 7 o'clock, when the food was cold and the sun had set, I knew something was wrong. The routine had been unbroken for 33 years. 33 years of 6 o'clock dinners. Thorn didn't just skip meals, not without reason. I left the food out all night, hoping, but in the morning it was still there, untouched. At 6:15, I'd started making excuses. Maybe they'd seen a bear and were waiting for it to move on. Maybe Shadow had gotten nervous about something and Thorn was reassuring them. Maybe they'd found a good food source deeper in the forest and lost track of time. I kept watching the tree line, expecting any moment to see that familiar shape emerge from the shadows. By 6:30, I was standing at the edge of my property, staring into the forest, calling out softly. My voice sounded hollow in the evening air. Nothing moved in the trees. The forest was silent, except for the evening birds and the wind through the pines. At 7 o'clock, I brought the plates inside and reheated everything, convinced they'd show up late and I wanted the food to be warm. I carried the plates back out and set them in their usual spots. Then I sat on my porch steps and waited. The temperature dropped, the stars came out, the food grew cold again, and the tree line stayed empty. I didn't go inside that night. I sat on those porch steps with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching, waiting, hoping. Every sound made me jerk my head up. Every shift of shadows made my heart leap. But it was just the wind, just animals moving through the underbrush, just the normal sounds of the forest that suddenly felt unbearably lonely. "Please," I said to the darkness around 2 in the morning, "please just let me know you're okay. You don't have to come for dinner. Just let me see you. Just let me know." But there was no response, no movement, no sign that anyone was listening. When dawn broke, I was still sitting there, stiff and cold and exhausted. The 3 plates sat where I'd placed them 9 hours earlier, the food congealed and unappetizing, covered in morning dew. Untouched. And that's when the truth really hit me. Thorn wasn't coming. Something had happened, something that had prevented him from making the walk he'd made every single day for 33 years. I went inside and called in sick to a volunteer position I had at the library, something I never did. Then I put on my hiking boots, grabbed a walking stick, and went into the forest. I had no idea where Thorn lived, where he went when he left my property. In 33 years, I'd never followed him. I'd respected his privacy, his need for a sanctuary away from the human world. But now I wished desperately that I had. Because I needed to find him, needed to know what had happened, needed to see him one more time. I searched for hours, calling his name, looking for signs, tracks, anything. But the forest was vast and indifferent, and I was 76 years old with bad knees and a weak heart. Eventually, I had to turn back, defeated and terrified. That evening at 6 o'clock, I cooked dinner again, set out 3 plates again, and waited. But deep down, I already knew Thorn wasn't coming back, and I might never know why. I spent the next 2 weeks searching the forest around my property, going further than I'd ever gone before, following trails I thought they might use, calling Thorn's name even though I knew he couldn't respond. I found evidence of them, broken branches, tracks, places where they'd bedded down in thick brush. But I didn't find them. Shadow appeared once, briefly, about 10 days after Thorn disappeared. I tried to ask through gestures what had happened, where Thorn was, but Shadow just looked at me with what seemed like sadness, touched my shoulder once, the same gesture Thorn had used decades ago, and then vanished back into the forest. I never saw Shadow again either. I spent months trying to figure out what happened. Had Thorn died? Had he been too old, too weak? And finally just stopped. Had he been hurt? Captured? I checked newspapers, called the Forest Service asking if there'd been any unusual sightings or incidents, but there was nothing. He'd simply stopped coming, and I was left with no answers, no closure, no body to mourn, no way to say goodbye. Every morning I'd wake up convinced that today would be the day I'd find him. I'd pack water and food, put on my hiking boots that were falling apart from 2 weeks of constant use, and head into the forest. My knees screamed at me. My back ached. I'd come home after dark, exhausted and empty-handed, and I'd do it all again the next day. I found a place about 3 miles northeast where the vegetation was pressed down in a large oval shape, like something big had been sleeping there regularly. The area smelled different, musky and wild, the same scent I'd sometimes caught from Thorn on humid evenings. I sat down in that spot and cried like I hadn't cried since my father died. Because this was where he'd lived. This was where he went after our dinners, where he slept, where he existed apart from me. And now, it was empty. When Shadow appeared on day 10, it was so sudden I almost didn't believe it was real. I was sitting on my porch at dusk, not even at 6 o'clock, just sitting there in the fading light feeling hollowed out and exhausted. And Shadow stepped out of the tree line, alone, moving with that cautious grace I'd come to recognize. I stood up so fast I nearly fell. "Shadow," I said, my voice cracking. "Shadow, where is he? Where's Thorn? Is he okay? Is he hurt?" Shadow came closer than they ever had before, close enough that I could see their eyes clearly, and what I saw there made my chest tighten. Grief. Shadow was grieving too. They gestured toward the forest, then made a downward motion with their hand. Down, laying down, resting, or dead. I couldn't tell which. I asked desperately. But Shadow shook their head slowly, definitively. No. Then they did something that destroyed me. They reached out, placed their hand on my shoulder with the same gentle pressure Thorn had used all those years ago, and looked at me with such profound sadness that I understood. Thorn was gone, and Shadow was saying goodbye, not just for themselves, but for him too, I said, as Shadow turned to go. But Shadow was already moving back toward the tree line, and something in their posture told me they wouldn't be returning. Maybe it hurt too much to come here without Thorn. Maybe they didn't feel safe without him as a guide. Maybe they had their own life to get back to, their own family somewhere in the forest. Whatever the reason, I watched them disappear into the trees, and I knew I was watching the last connection to Thorn vanish. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. I called the local newspaper asking if there'd been any reports of unusual wildlife. I contacted the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, asking about large animal sightings. I even called a few Bigfoot research groups, trying to be vague, asking if they'd heard anything about the Hungry Horse area. Nothing. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. And the worst part was that I couldn't properly mourn. I couldn't tell anyone what I'd lost. When people asked why I looked so tired, so sad, I'd say I was dealing with some health issues, or that I was just feeling my age. How do you explain that you're grieving your best friend of 33 years when that friend wasn't supposed to exist? How do you mourn someone the world insists is just a myth? 8 years have passed since that October evening. I'm 81 now, still living in the same house on the same property, still cooking dinner at 6 o'clock every single night. I set 2 plates, one for me and one for Thorn, even though I know he's not coming. The therapist I saw for a while thought I was in denial, that I needed to accept that my imaginary friend wasn't real and move on. I stopped seeing her after that. The people in town think I'm eccentric at best, probably senile, the old man who lives alone in the woods and talks about feeding Bigfoot. But I know what I had for 33 years. I had family, I had friendship, I had someone who showed up for me every single day without fail, who taught me that connection doesn't require words, that kindness can cross any divide. I don't know if Thorn is dead or alive. I don't know if he thinks about me the way I think about him. But I know that for 33 years, I was less alone because of him. And that's worth setting an extra plate for the rest of my life. The routine hasn't changed. At 5:30, I start cooking. Nothing fancy anymore. My hands shake too much for complicated recipes, but I still make real food. Pot roast chicken and vegetables, sometimes just a good steak. At 6 o'clock, I carry 2 plates outside and set them in their usual spots. Mine on the porch table, Thorn's near the fire pit. Then I sit down and eat my dinner, and I talk to him like he's still there. Cold tonight, I'll say, watching my breath fog in the October air. Or, the young couple who bought the property next to mine last year, they've seen me doing this. I caught them watching once, standing at their property line, whispering to each other. The next week, the wife came over with a casserole and asked, very gently, if I had family nearby, if there was someone who checked on me. I told her I was fine, that I liked my routine, and that I wasn't crazy no matter what it looked like. She hasn't been back. My doctor thinks I'm depressed. Probably am, by clinical standards, but I don't feel depressed. I feel like someone who had something precious and lost it, and is doing his best to honor what it meant. There's a difference, even if no one else can see it. Sometimes, on clear nights, I stay outside long after dinner's over, just sitting on the porch steps watching the tree line. Part of me is still waiting, still hoping that one evening I'll see that familiar shape emerge from the shadows. That Thorn will come walking out of the forest like he's been doing for 33 years, like nothing ever changed. But the rational part of me knows that's not going to happen. He's gone. Whether he died or just couldn't make the journey anymore or decided it was time to move on, he's gone. But here's what I've learned in 8 years of setting that extra plate. It's not about whether he's coming back. It's about what he gave me. For 33 years, I had purpose. I had someone who needed me, who counted on me, who showed up because I mattered to them. That healed something in me that had been broken since my divorce, maybe even longer. It taught me that family isn't about blood or species or even shared language. It's about showing up. It's about consistency. It's about caring whether someone else is okay. And if people think I'm crazy for mourning a creature that science says doesn't exist, well, let them think that. I know the truth. I lived it. Every evening for 33 years, I shared dinner with proof that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we're willing to admit. That connection can happen in the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely beings. That loneliness is a choice we don't have to keep making. The stone Thorn gave me all those years ago, the one he placed between us when I was hurting, it still sits on my kitchen windowsill. Just a smooth river rock that could be from anywhere. But when I hold it, I remember what it meant. I'm here. You're not alone. I wasn't alone for 33 years. And even now, setting that extra plate every evening, I'm still not alone. Because love doesn't disappear just because the person you love does. The connection remains, the memory remains, the gratitude for having had it at all remains. That's why I keep setting 2 plates, not because I think he's coming back, but because for 33 years, someone showed up at 6 o'clock, and that meant everything. and I'm not going to dishonor that by pretending it didn't happen just because it's easier for other people to understand.